The season is essentially finished, and there is no way to soften what Detroit Lions fans are watching right now. One game left, no spoiler roll, no dramatic twist coming, just a team walking toward the end of the year with frustration hanging in the air. There is a real chance this group finishes with a losing record for the first time since 2021, or at best scrapes together a 9-win season that feels hollow when you remember that 9 wins was never supposed to be the standard anymore. What makes it worse is that this year confirmed something uncomfortable. The Lions did not beat good teams when it mattered. They managed wins against only 2 teams that had winning records at the time, and even those come with context that strips away any sense of dominance. This was not a bad team, but it was not a good one either, and that gray area is where disappointment lives. Smash that like button if you're still carrying that same feeling of frustration. And if you can, drop your thoughts in the comments about this whole situation. What hurts the most is the familiar feeling. For fans who have been here long enough, this feels like sliding backward into a place everyone hoped was finally behind them. After 2 seasons of progress, energy, and belief, the vibe now feels like regression. And that frustration has found an easy target, just like it always does in Detroit: the quarterback. Jared Goff has become the lightning rod for anger, and that alone should make every Lions fan pause, because this script has already played out before. Matthew Stafford lived this exact story for over a decade. Year after year, the narrative was that you could not win with him, that he was the problem, that something about him was missing. Eventually, after coaching changes and front office turnover, Stafford asked out, and history moved on without Detroit learning the lesson. Now it is happening again. Jared Goff is being blamed in a way that ignores everything around him. This is not about pretending Goff is flawless. He is not. No quarterback is. But the idea that he is the central reason this team is failing collapses under even minimal scrutiny. Earlier this season, Goff led the entire NFL in completion percentage at 74%. That does not happen by accident. That is efficiency, rhythm, and trust between quarterback and offense. As the team began to fall apart, that number dropped dramatically, not because Goff suddenly forgot how to play football, but because everything around him deteriorated. Offensive line issues, lack of balance, defensive collapses forcing the offense into impossible situations, all of it piled up. The criticism that Goff cannot elevate a team or create plays ignores context completely. Quarterbacks need protection. Ask Matthew Stafford. Ask Lamar Jackson. Ask Josh Allen. Even the most physically gifted players struggle when the structure collapses. Goff is a precision quarterback. If receivers are where they are supposed to be, he will deliver the ball. That connection is part of why Amon-Ra St. Brown developed into the player he is today. That does not happen in a vacuum. Yet fans act as if Goff exists separately from the offense he leads. The deeper issue is not the quarterback, it is the pattern. Jared Goff is under contract for years. The Lions committed to him. By the time this deal reaches its potential exit point, Detroit will have spent nearly 2 decades cycling between 2 quarterbacks while arguing that both were the problem. That should be alarming, because when the same result keeps happening with different players, the answer is not the player. This team has failed at the organizational level, especially on defense. That is not opinion, it is documented reality. Since 2021, the Lions' defense has consistently ranked near the bottom of the league. In 2021, it was among the worst. In 2022, it was historically bad before a late-season turnaround masked deeper flaws. In 2023, even during a run to the NFC Championship game, the defense ranked 19th. That is not championship-level football. In 2024, the defense again finished around 20th overall. Year after year, the offense carried this team, and year after year, the defense was just good enough to fool people into thinking the foundation was solid.
When the Lions blew a 17-point lead in the NFC Championship game, the explanation was right there. A middling defense finally cracked under playoff pressure. Jared Goff did not turn the ball over in that game. The offense did enough. Drops, a crucial fumble, questionable play calling, and a lack of defensive answers decided the outcome. Yet the blame drifted back to the quarterback, because that is what Detroit does. Brad Holmes is responsible for personnel. That includes a pass rush that never arrived, defensive depth that never materialized, and repeated decisions to avoid aggressive moves when the window was clearly open. Dan Campbell is responsible for coaching, culture, and game management. Both deserve credit for pulling this franchise out of the basement, but credit does not erase accountability. The defense has never finished higher than the middle of the league during this era, and no team wins championships like that unless everything else is perfect. What Lions fans are feeling right now is not just anger, it is déjà vu. The embers of past failures never fully went out. They were covered up by offensive production and early success, but now that the cracks are exposed, the frustration is back. The most dangerous part is how quickly the fan base is turning on the one player who has been consistently productive within a flawed structure. So the real question moving forward is not whether Jared Goff is perfect, but whether the Lions are about to repeat the same mistake they made for 12 years with Matthew Stafford, blaming the most visible piece instead of fixing the foundation. With everything laid out in front of you, do you honestly believe the quarterback is the real problem here, or are we watching history repeat itself all over again? What makes this situation even more frustrating is how clear the timeline actually is when you step back and look at it without emotion. Since Brad Holmes and Dan Campbell took over, the defense has never once finished a season as a true strength of this team. Not once. In 2021, the Lions finished with one of the worst defenses in football, and the record reflected it. In 2022, they started 1-6 while the defense was on a historic pace for giving up points, and even though the season ended strong, the damage was already done. In 2023, the year everyone points to as proof that this rebuild worked, the defense still ranked 19th. And in 2024, after all the talk about growth and continuity, the defense again hovered around the 20th range. That is the full body of work. That is not cherry picking. That is the reality of this era of Detroit Lions football. And yet, through all of that, the offense has remained productive, competitive, and often elite. Since 2022, this team has gone as far as it has gone because the offense carried it there. That offense is led by Jared Goff. You do not accidentally reach an NFC championship game with a quarterback who cannot win. You do not sustain offensive success for multiple seasons with a quarterback who is supposedly holding you back. That narrative only survives if you refuse to look at the other side of the ball. There is also a strange double standard at play that Lions fans need to confront honestly. When Matthew Stafford was in Detroit, he was never fully embraced as an MVP caliber quarterback, even in seasons where his numbers demanded it. He was always treated as a dark horse, always viewed with skepticism. The moment he left and won a Super Bowl, the conversation flipped overnight. The same player, same skill set, suddenly validated. Now Jared Goff is living that same experience in real time. He puts up efficient numbers, leads a top offense, and still gets treated like a placeholder instead of a solution. This is not about pretending Goff is above criticism. He has bad games. He makes mistakes. Every quarterback does. But the level of scrutiny he receives compared to others around the league is completely disproportionate to his actual performance. Quarterbacks on teams with strong defenses are allowed to have off days. Quarterbacks on teams without defensive support are expected to be perfect. That is not football reality. That is fan frustration looking for a face. The harsh truth is that the Lions' best chance to win a Super Bowl was in 2023. That was the window. The offense was humming, the roster was healthy enough, and the conference was wide open. That was the moment when aggressive moves could have pushed this team over the top. A pass rusher at the deadline, defensive reinforcements in free agency, something to balance the scales. Instead, the roster stayed largely the same, and the flaws that had been ignored all season finally showed themselves on the biggest stage. Now the language has shifted. What was once ahead of schedule has quietly turned into retooling. That shift matters, because when you zoom out, you are staring at a reality where, by the end of Jared Goff's contract, the Detroit Lions will have spent nearly 19 years with two quarterbacks while failing to solve the same organizational issues. That is not bad luck. That is systemic failure. The most dangerous thing the franchise could do right now is panic and repeat old habits. Turning on the quarterback might feel satisfying, but it does nothing to address the real problems. Defense wins championships. Roster balance matters. Accountability starts at the top. Until those truths are fully embraced, changing the name under center will only restart the same cycle. This fan base deserves honesty, not comfort. The Lions are not broken beyond repair, but they are exposed. The Flex seal is gone. The cracks are visible. And what happens next will define whether this era ends as a stepping stone or another missed opportunity buried under excuses. Now I want to hear from you. Do you believe the Lions are making the same mistake all over again by putting the blame on Jared Goff? Or do you think this team's real issues run much deeper than the quarterback position? The uncomfortable part of this conversation is that it forces everyone to look past surface-level reactions and into decisions that were made long before the losses piled up. This season did not collapse in one game. and it did not collapse because of one player. It collapsed because the same weaknesses were ignored year after year, even when success temporarily hid them. The defense never truly improved to a championship standard, it only fluctuated between bad and mediocre. That is not enough in a league where the margins are razor thin, especially in January. What stands out is how often this team asked the offense to be perfect. Time after time, Jared Goff and the offense were expected to compensate for defensive breakdowns, short fields, and momentum swings. That is not sustainable football. When a team consistently ranks near the bottom half of the league defensively, the quarterback is forced into situations where every possession feels like it has to end in points. That pressure changes play calling, decision-making, and outcomes. It is not an excuse, it is context. The irony is that many of the same voices calling for change at quarterback are the same ones who acknowledge how close this team came in 2023. You do not accidentally fall one half away from a Super Bowl. You get there because the core is strong. But instead of reinforcing the weakest unit, the organization chose patience over urgency. That choice is now being paid for in frustration, finger-pointing, and a fan base that feels like the ground is shifting again. There's also a psychological element here that cannot be ignored. Detroit fans carry decades of scars. When things start to slide, the instinct is to assume the worst and brace for collapse. That mindset makes it easier to turn on individuals rather than confront structural problems, because structural problems take longer to fix and require uncomfortable accountability. Blaming the quarterback is familiar. It feels actionable. It feels like control. But history shows it leads nowhere. Jared Goff did not build this roster. He did not decide how resources were allocated. He did not choose to pass on defensive upgrades when the window was open. What he did do was operate an offense that kept this team competitive far longer than it had any right to be based on defensive performance alone. Remove him without fixing the foundation, and the outcome will look painfully familiar. The Lions are now at a crossroads. They can either learn from the patterns staring them in the face, or they can repeat them and hope for a different result. Real growth means admitting that the quarterback position has been one of the few areas of stability, not chaos. It means demanding more from roster construction, defensive identity, and long-term vision. Until that happens, no new name under center will change the ending. This is not about protecting one player. It is about protecting the future of the franchise from another wasted decade. The next moves will tell us everything about whether this organization has truly evolved or is simply cycling through the same mistakes with better branding. There's one more layer to this that Lions fans need to seriously wrestle with, because it goes beyond wins and losses and straight into identity. For the first time in a long time, Detroit found stability at quarterback. That matters more than people want to admit. Stability is what allows franchises to build, to take calculated risks, and to refine the roster around a known constant. What the Lions have done instead is treat that stability as disposable the moment adversity shows up. That mindset is dangerous, because it signals that the organization and the fan base still do not fully understand how hard it is to find competent, reliable quarterback play in the NFL. Look around the league. Teams cycle through quarterbacks for decades chasing what Detroit already has. And yet, because Jared Goff does not fit a certain aesthetic, because he does not play with flash or swagger, because he is not improvising off script every snap, he is viewed as replaceable. That is not football analysis. That is preference masquerading as evaluation. Goff is a system quarterback, yes, but systems are how championships are won when they are built correctly. The problem is not that the system exists. The problem is that the system has been unbalanced for years. The Lions have asked the offense to mask defensive incompetence since 2022. That is not sustainable, and it never was. When things were clicking, it looked magical. When injuries hit, when protection slipped, when defenses adjusted, there was nothing on the other side of the ball to stabilize games. That is how leads disappear. That is how seasons unravel. Not because the quarterback suddenly forgot how to play, but because football is complementary, and Detroit has not played complementary football in a very long time. Another uncomfortable truth is that development stalled where it mattered most. Defensive investment did not match offensive ambition. Draft picks and resources failed to translate into dominance. And instead of correcting course aggressively, the organization leaned into optimism and continuity. Optimism does not stop opposing quarterbacks. Continuity does not generate pass rush. Those things require talent and urgency. This is why the conversation about Jared Goff feels so misplaced. It skips past the real evaluation. Has he been perfect? No. Has he been good enough to win with a properly built roster? The evidence says yes. And if that is true, then the question becomes why the roster around him has not reached the same standard. That question is far more uncomfortable, because it does not have an easy fix or a quick scapegoat. Detroit is now facing the consequences of choices that were made when the window was open. The league does not wait. Other teams adjust. Other teams reload. Standing still is the same as moving backward. If the Lions respond to this moment by tearing down the wrong pillar, they risk undoing the progress that actually did happen. What happens next will define this era more than any single game ever could. Will the Lions confront the real flaws and correct them, or will they chase familiarity by blaming the most visible position again? Because if history has taught this fan base anything, it is that changing quarterbacks without changing structure only resets the clock. At some point, this fan base has to decide whether it wants truth or comfort, because the two rarely arrive together. Comfort says the answer is simple, that one change fixes everything, that swapping out the quarterback resets expectations and cures frustration. Truth says the Lions are dealing with a layered problem that has been years in the making. Truth says progress stalled not because the offense failed, but because the rest of the roster never caught up to it. When you examine how this team was built, the imbalance is impossible to ignore. Offensive continuity was prioritized, and in many ways it paid off. The Lions became a team that could score, control tempo, and compete with anyone on a good day. But defense remained reactive instead of proactive. It was patched together instead of transformed. And when pressure moments arrived, those cracks widened exactly the way they always do for teams that rely too heavily on one side of the ball. This is where accountability really matters. A general manager's job is not just to draft well or retain familiar pieces. It is to recognize when a roster has reached its ceiling and needs bold adjustments. A head coach's job is not only to inspire belief, but to demand balance and discipline across all phases. Both roles deserve credit for lifting this franchise out of irrelevance, but credit does not exempt anyone from criticism when growth plateaus. The danger now is emotional decision-making. Fans are tired. Players are frustrated. The noise is loud. That is when organizations make mistakes. That is when they confuse urgency with impatience. Urgency builds on strengths and attacks weaknesses. Impatience tears down what works because it feels easier than fixing what does not. Jared Goff has become the symbol of that tension, not because he represents failure, but because he represents an uncomfortable truth. The Lions have been close without ever being complete, and until they confront that reality honestly, they will keep circling the same arguments, the same disappointments, and the same endings. This moment will either be remembered as the point where Detroit finally learned from its past, or as another chapter in a story that never quite changes. The pieces are there. The lesson is there. The only question left is whether the organization